Flying with Asian Airlines once carried a certain expectation: well-trained crews, consistent service, and the feeling that long-haul travel was handled with precision. For many passengers, the flight itself felt like part of the experience, not just a means to an end. Today, that picture looks very different. Delays stretch on with little explanation. Cabins feel tighter. Basic services quietly disappear, while prices keep climbing. The Polish is fading, but the pressure on passengers is growing. So here's the real question. In today's Asian skies, which airlines are still worth flying, and which ones have changed so much they're almost unrecognizable? In this video, we've ranked major Asian airlines, from the ones you should avoid at all costs, to the few that still deliver a reliable human experience. And starting at the bottom of our list is an airline almost everyone recognizes, and very few question. Number 15. Air India. Let me ask you something. How can an airline this well-known still feel this unpredictable to fly? Air India is one of the most recognizable Asian carriers among American travelers, especially on routes to India, the Middle East, and beyond. On paper, it should be a solid choice. In reality, the experience often tells a very different story. Passengers regularly describe flights that feel disorganized from the moment boarding begins. Cabin conditions vary wildly between aircraft, service quality depends heavily on the crew you happen to get, and delays are treated less like exceptions and more like part of the process. When things go wrong, communication is often vague or delayed, leaving travelers guessing instead of informed. That inconsistency is the real problem. You might have a perfectly fine flight one day, then a deeply frustrating one the next, on the same route, with the same airline. Aging interiors, uneven maintenance perception, and overwhelmed ground operations compound the stress, especially for long-haul travelers coming from the U.S. To be fair, Air India is trying to change. New aircraft orders, refreshed branding, and promises of modernization point toward a better future. But for passengers flying today, those improvements are still more visible in press releases than in the cabin. Here's the takeaway. Popularity does not equal reliability. Until Air India delivers consistent service across its fleet and routes, it remains a gamble, one that many travelers don't realize they're taking until they're already stuck at the gate. And that's why it sits at the bottom of this list. And if you've ever flown with Air India, what was your experience like? Was it better than expected, or exactly what you feared? Share it in the comments. Your experience might genuinely help other travelers make a better choice. And now, let's move on to number 14. Because this next airline avoided the bottom spot for a reason, but in some ways, the problems here are even more frustrating. Number 14. Saudi Arabian Airlines. One frequent flyer summed it up perfectly. Nothing actually went wrong, and somehow everything felt difficult. That's the defining problem with Saudi Arabian Airlines. Flights usually depart. The aircraft are modern. Crews follow procedures closely. On paper, the airline does what it's supposed to do, but as a passenger, the experience often feels like moving through resistance at every step. Simple interactions take effort. Boarding feels slow and overly procedural. Questions get answers, but rarely solutions. When plans change, even slightly, the system struggles to respond in a human way. You're guided through rules, not helped through situations. That same dynamic continues on board. Service is restrained, formal, and distant. Nothing is overtly wrong, but very little feels comfortable. Requests feel discouraged rather than welcomed, and the atmosphere never quite relaxes. Over a long flight, that tension becomes tiring. What makes this especially frustrating is how hard it is to point to a single failure. There's no moment you can clearly blame, no obvious breakdown. Just a steady sense that every part of the journey requires more patience than it should. And that's why many travelers finish these flights feeling oddly exhausted. Not because something went wrong, but because nothing ever felt easy. For a long-haul airline, that's a problem you don't notice immediately. You feel it later. And now, this next airline is one of the largest state-linked carriers in Asia, built around scale, hierarchy, and strict top-down decision-making. efficient on paper, but often slow to adapt once a passenger issue appears. If you've ever flown with a Chinese carrier where procedure clearly outweighs flexibility, you already know which airline we're talking about. Number 13. China Eastern Airlines. At first glance, this airline feels reassuringly large and established. It operates an enormous network, moves huge numbers of passengers every year, and plays a central role in connecting Asia with the rest of the world. For American travelers, it often appears as a practical, no-nonsense option, especially on routes involving mainland China. The experience, however, is shaped heavily by structure rather than service. Operations are built around strict procedures, layered approval systems, and a very clear hierarchy. That approach works efficiently when everything follows the schedule, but it becomes limiting the moment something deviates from the plan. Delays, gate changes, or missed connections are where the cracks start to show. Information tends to arrive late and without context, not because staff are careless, but because decision-making authority sits far above the front line. Ground crews often know something is wrong, yet lack the autonomy to act quickly or explain clearly. For passengers, that creates a sense of detachment from their own journey. On board, the tone is polite but distant, service is functional, rarely warm, and focused on execution rather than engagement. The cabin itself is usually acceptable, sometimes comfortable, but seldom memorable. Over long-haul flights, that emotional distance becomes noticeable, especially for travelers accustomed to more communicative airlines. What ultimately defines this experience isn't a single failure, but a persistent feeling of opacity. Things happen, announcements are made, instructions are given, yet passengers are rarely told why. You move from point A to point B, but without ever feeling fully informed or involved. For an airline of this size and reach, that lack of transparency quietly undermines trust. And next, we're moving to an airline closely associated with South Korea's flag carrier era. Long-haul route, traditional service standards, and a name many travelers first encountered decades ago. Number 12. Asiana Airlines. For a long time, this airline carried a very specific reputation. It was seen as calm, polite, and quietly dependable, especially on long-haul routes between the US and Asia. Many travelers still book it expecting that familiar sense of balance, not flashy, not chaotic, just solid. What they often encounter today feels less certain. The experience now depends heavily on timing, aircraft, and route. Some flights still deliver exactly what passengers expect: decent comfort, courteous service, and a smooth journey. Others feel noticeably dated, both in atmosphere and execution. Cabins can vary significantly, entertainment systems feel behind the curve, and the overall product lacks a clear modern identity. What stands out most is the feeling of transition. Feel broken, but it also doesn't feel settled. Processes work, yet they don't always flow. Service is polite, but sometimes hesitant, as if crews are following guidance that hasn't fully caught up with passenger expectation. Over long flight, that uncertainty subtly affects the experience. For American travelers, this can be confusing. Expectations are shaped by past impressions, but the reality doesn't always match. When things go slightly off schedule, responses tend to be careful rather than confident, which can make small issues feel larger than they are. There's still professionalism here, and moments of genuine warmth do appear, but consistency, not chaos, not rigidity, is the missing piece. You don't walk away frustrated in an obvious way. You walk away unsure of what version of the airline you'll get next time. Number 11. China Airlines. This airline often gives the impression that it's doing the bare minimum, and doing it deliberately. From the moment the journey begins, the experience feels stripped down to essentials, with very little effort made to smooth edges or elevate the flight beyond basic transportation. Cabins tend to feel dated, even when they're technically well-maintained. Seating comfort is serviceable at best. Legroom rarely surprises in a positive way, and in-flight entertainment often feels like an afterthought rather than a feature. Over long distances, that lack of refinement becomes increasingly noticeable, especially when fatigue sets in. Service follows the same pattern. Crews are professional and polite, but noticeably passive. Interactions feel scripted, not engaged. Requests are handled, but rarely anticipated. There's little sense that anyone is actively trying to improve the journey once it's underway. The flight moves forward, but without warmth, urgency, or care. What makes this particularly frustrating is that nothing here feels accidental. The experience comes across as intentionally low effort, as if the airline has settled into a comfort zone where good enough is considered sufficient. When delays or small disruptions occur, communication tends to be brief and reactive, offering updates without reassurance or clarity. By the time passengers disembark, the prevailing feeling isn't relief or satisfaction. It's indifference mixed with mild disappointment. You didn't suffer, but you also didn't feel looked after. At this point in the ranking, that's not enough. A long-haul airline that treats the experience as a checklist rather than a responsibility earns its place among the weaker options. And next, we're moving to an airline long associated with a city that functioned as a true global crossroads. A place built on international finance, glass towers, and non-stop movement between continents. For years, flying through that hub symbolized seamless travel between East and West. Number 10, Cathay Pacific. Choosing this airline still feels, at least initially, like a sensible decision. The brand carries weight, the network looks strong, and many passengers expect a smooth, well-managed long-haul experience. That expectation is exactly what makes the reality feel underwhelming. What becomes apparent fairly quickly is how narrow the experience has become. Cabins are orderly but plain, with little sense of care or refinement beyond what's strictly necessary. Seating comfort is acceptable, though hardly competitive, and onboard entertainment feels dated compared to what similarly positioned airlines now offer. Nothing actively irritates, but very little reassures either. Service adds to that impression. Crews are polite and professional, yet noticeably reserved. Interactions tend to be brief and transactional, with minimal effort to engage or adapt. Requests are handled correctly, but without the confidence or presence that once defined the airline. Over a long flight, that emotional flatness becomes tiring. The bigger issue is how cautious everything feels. The airline operates competently, but without energy or ambition. Processes are followed, announcements are made, and the flight progresses. Yet the journey lacks flow. There's no sense that the airline is trying to win you over or justify its reputation. By the time you arrive, the dominant feeling isn't frustration, but disappointment. You expected more from a name like this. Instead, you get an experience that feels scaled down, conservative, and stuck between past prestige and present reality. A carrier known for bold ideas, shifting strategies, and a brand that has changed direction more than once over the years. And the next airline on our list is often associated with innovation. But in this case, constant innovation hasn't always translated into a better experience. Number 9. Etihad Airways. Few airlines have tried to reinvent themselves as often as this one. Over the years, the brand has cycled through different visions of what premium travel should look like, each promising something new, different, and more refined. The problem is that this constant reshaping has made the experience harder to pin down. Rather than evolving along a clear path, the product feels fragmented. Cabin concepts arrive with big expectations, only to be adjusted, reduced, or quietly phased out. What feels modern and well thought out on one aircraft can feel surprisingly basic on another. For passengers, that creates uncertainty before the flight even begins. Inside the cabin, the contrast is noticeable. Some seats are genuinely comfortable and thoughtfully designed, while others feel like compromises. Entertainment quality varies. Storage solutions aren't consistent, and even the overall atmosphere changes depending on the aircraft type. The airline's ambition is visible, but its execution lacks uniformity. Service reflects a similar pattern. Crews are usually competent and professional, Yet the tone of interaction shifts from flight to flight. Sometimes it feels confident and attentive, other times distant and procedural. The experience depends too much on variables the passenger can't control. Operationally, things tend to function without major issues. Flights run, connections work, and logistics are handled, but the journey lacks a stable identity. You don't know which version of the airline you'll encounter, and that unpredictability erodes confidence over time. Experimentation can push an airline forward when it builds on a solid foundation. Here, it often feels like change for the sake of change. And next, we're heading to an airline shaped by a country that has always sat between continents. A place where Europe and Asia meet, where history, cuisine, and trade have crossed paths for centuries, and where one city became a global aviation crossroads almost overnight. This carrier built its identity on scale, reach, and connection, flying almost everywhere to almost anyone. Do you already know which airline comes next? Number 8. Turkish Airlines. This airline is often admired for one thing above all else: reach. Its route map is enormous, connecting more cities than almost any other carrier in the world. For many travelers, it becomes the default option simply because it goes everywhere, often at competitive prices, and offers convenient connections through a single massive hub. That scale, however, comes with a trade-off. The experience can vary dramatically from one flight to the next. Some journeys feel genuinely impressive, with comfortable cabins, generous meals, and attentive service that rivals far more premium airlines. Others feel rushed, crowded, and poorly coordinated, as if the operation is struggling to keep up with its own size. The gap between those two outcomes is what defines this airline. Cabin quality depends heavily on aircraft type. Newer planes can feel modern and spacious, storage, and entertainment systems. On long-haul flights, those differences matter, especially when expectations are shaped by past positive experiences that may not repeat. Service reflects a similar inconsistency. Crews are often hardworking and well-intentioned, but the overall flow can feel chaotic. Meal services may feel disorganized, communication uneven, and the onboard atmosphere louder and more hectic than many passengers expect on long international routes. It's not a lack of effort, it's a lack of refinement. On the ground, that same intensity continues. Transfers can be efficient, but they can also feel overwhelming, especially during peak hours. The system works, but it rarely feels calm. What makes this frustrating is the potential. When everything aligns, the experience is genuinely good. When it doesn't, the journey feels draining rather than reassuring. And next, we're moving to an airline that doesn't get much attention. It's rarely anyone's first pick, but it also tends to avoid the kinds of issues we've been talking about so far. Not outstanding, but generally not a bad choice either. Number 7. EVA Air. This is an airline many travelers don't actively seek out, but also rarely regret choosing. It doesn't dominate conversations, it doesn't rely on a flashy image, and it doesn't try to reinvent long-haul travel. Instead, its entire approach seems built around one idea: delivering a flight that functions the way passengers expect it to without unnecessary surprises. That philosophy is visible on board. Cabins are generally clean, orderly, and well-maintained, even if they don't feel particularly modern or stylish. Seating comfort is reasonable, legroom is acceptable by long-haul standards, and in-flight entertainment usually covers the essentials without drawing much attention to itself. Nothing here feels premium, but very little feels neglected either. Over long distances, that kind of balance can be quietly reassuring. Service follows the same restrained pattern. Crews tend to be professional, polite, and efficient, without leaning heavily into friendliness or formality. Interactions are straightforward, requests are handled competently, and the cabin atmosphere remains calm throughout the flight. There's no strong personality shaping the experience, but there's also very little friction or tension. From an operational standpoint, the airline is generally predictable. Schedules are managed competently, transfers are manageable, and communication is clear enough to to keep passengers oriented. When minor disruptions occur, they're usually handled without escalating into larger frustrations. The system feels organized, even if it never feels especially warm or memorable. What ultimately defines this airline is restraint. It doesn't overpromise, and it rarely underdelivers. Passengers typically step off the plane feeling neither impressed nor disappointed, simply finished with their journey and ready to move on. Number 6. Korean Air. There's a certain predictability to flying with a large legacy carrier that's been operating long-haul routes for decades. You don't expect surprises, and you don't expect reinvention. What you expect is a system that knows how to move a lot of people over very long distances without unnecessary drama. That's largely what this airline delivers. Cabins tend to feel practical rather than modern. Seating is generally comfortable, and legroom is often better than average, especially compared to newer high-density configurations used elsewhere. At the same time, interiors can feel dated on some aircraft, and the overall design lacks the refinement or warmth that other international carriers have gradually introduced. Service follows a structured, professional approach. Crews are attentive and disciplined, but interaction is often formal and reserved. Requests are handled correctly, yet rarely anticipated. The experience feels efficient, though not especially personal. Over long flights, that can either feel reassuring or emotionally flat, depending on what a passenger values. Catering is consistent but rarely memorable. Meals arrive on schedule, portions are reasonable, and presentation is functional. Entertainment systems usually offer a broad selection, but the interface and content don't always feel up to date. Again, nothing stands out, positively or negatively, which becomes a recurring theme. Operationally, the airline benefits from scale and experience. Flights tend to follow established routines. Communication is clear enough to keep passengers oriented, and the overall flow of the journey feels controlled. When minor issues arise, they're usually handled methodically, though not always quickly. What defines the experience most is balance. Strengths and weaknesses largely cancel each other out. You're unlikely to feel stressed, but also unlikely to feel impressed. The flight does what it's meant to do, without demanding much attention. And this is where things clearly shift. We're moving to the airline that was trusted to launch Boeing's 787 Dreamliner, the one whose blue and white tail became inseparable from that aircraft. If that immediately brings a specific name to mind, you're already there. Number 5. All Nippon Airways. You notice it before anyone says a word. Boarding moves quietly. Lines form naturally. People seem to know where to stand and when to move, even if it's their first time flying this route. The entire process feels rehearsed, not for speed, but for calm. That tone carries through the rest of the journey. Once airborne, the experience doesn't try to win you over with big gestures. Instead, it removes small sources of friction one by one. Lighting feels intentional. Noise levels stay low. Even during busy moments, the cabin rarely feels rushed or chaotic. Long-haul travel here feels managed rather than endured. The crew plays a key role in that atmosphere, though not in an obvious way. Interactions are precise and restrained. Requests are acknowledged quickly, often before they escalate into problems. There's little improvisation, but also little need for it. Everything operates within a clearly defined rhythm that keeps the flight moving smoothly. That structure does come with trade-offs. Passengers looking for warmth, spontaneity, or a sense of personality may find the experience emotionally distant. Meals are consistent and carefully presented, but rarely memorable. Entertainment is modern and reliable, yet curated conservatively. Nothing feels experimental. Where this airline excels is continuity. Aircraft condition, procedures, and overall flow remain consistent across routes and schedules. You rarely feel like you've drawn the short straw. The experience you expect is usually the experience you get. What stands out most isn't luxury or innovation, but intent. This airline doesn't try to surprise passengers. It tries to eliminate uncertainty. For travelers who value predictability and mental ease over excitement, that approach can make a long flight feel significantly shorter. Number 4. Japan Airlines. If ANA feels like a finely tuned system, this airline feels more like a well-trained host. From the start, the experience leans less on structure and more on atmosphere. There's still order, still precision, but it's delivered in a way that feels softer and more personal. The difference shows up quickly. Boarding feels welcoming rather than procedural. Interactions are warmer, eye contact lasts a little longer, and the tone throughout the cabin feels intentionally human. The airline seems to care not just about moving passengers efficiently, but about how they feel while doing it. During the flight, that approach becomes more apparent. The cabin environment feels relaxed without slipping into disorder. Crews engage more naturally, adapting to passengers rather than strictly following a script. Small gestures, timing, tone, awareness make the journey feel less mechanical and more attentive. That said, this warmth doesn't mean indulgence. The experience remains restrained and controlled. Comfort is solid, but not extravagant. Entertainment and catering are thoughtfully presented, though rarely bold or surprising. The airline prioritizes familiarity and ease over novelty. What makes this stand out is emotional consistency. Even on long-haul routes, the experience rarely feels cold or distant. When minor issues arise, they're handled with a level of care that reassures passengers rather than simply informing them. The flight feels guided, not managed. There are trade-offs. Some travelers may prefer the ultra-polished predictability of ANA. Others may find this airline slightly less efficient in comparison, especially when measured purely by process. But for many, the added warmth more than compensates. What defines this experience isn't luxury or innovation, it's hospitality. And for passengers who value being treated like a guest rather than part of a system, that distinction makes a real difference. Number 3. Emirates. This airline doesn't try to be subtle. From the moment you book the ticket, everything about the experience signals scale, confidence, and spectacle. Emirates built its reputation by turning long-haul flying into something closer to a production than a process, and that philosophy still defines how the airline feels today. The first thing most passengers notice is space. Cabins feel larger, lighting is dramatic, and the overall presentation is designed to impress. Entertainment is one of the strongest points, offering an enormous selection that can genuinely carry you through very long flights. For travelers who measure comfort by distraction and visual polish, this approach works extremely well. Service leans in the same direction. Crews are highly visible, energetic, and trained to project attentiveness at all times. Interactions feel polished and confident, though sometimes a bit performative. You're rarely left waiting, but you're also rarely left alone. The experience feels managed in a very deliberate way. Where opinions start to split is consistency. With such a large fleet and such a wide network, not every aircraft delivers the same level of refinement. Some cabins feel impressively modern, others noticeably behind the curve. Comfort can vary more than passengers expect from a brand this prominent. Catering is generous and predictable, though not especially personal. The airline excels at scale, but that scale sometimes smooths away individuality. What you gain in reliability and presentation, you lose slightly in intimacy. And at number 2 sits an airline that built its reputation on discipline so consistent it became legendary. A carrier known for immaculate cabins, quietly obsessive attention to detail, and a standard of service that other airlines openly measure themselves against. If a green and gold uniform already comes to mind, you know exactly who's next. Number 2. Singapore Airlines. There's a reason so many other carriers quietly benchmark themselves against this name. The experience feels engineered rather than assembled, as if every element was designed to fit into a larger system that rarely allows things to drift out of place. From the moment the cabin settles after takeoff, the environment feels controlled and intentional. Lighting, noise levels, and pacing work together to create a sense of calm that holds even on long, busy flights. Comfort doesn't come from spectacle, but from consistency. Seats feel supportive, layouts feel balanced, and nothing seems added or removed without a reason. The service culture is unmistakable. Crews operate with a level of discipline that's immediately noticeable, moving through the cabin with confidence and precision. Interactions are polite, composed, and highly consistent. Requests are handled smoothly, often without follow-up, and the overall flow of the flight feels carefully choreographed rather than reactive. That same discipline shapes the rest of the experience. Meals are thoughtfully prepared and reliably well executed, though rarely bold. Entertainment systems are extensive and modern, but presented with restraint. There's very little improvisation and almost no visible variation between flights. For some passengers, that perfection can feel slightly distant. Personality takes a back seat to process, and emotional warmth is secondary to execution. The journey feels guided rather than shared. What sets this experience apart is how rarely it breaks its own rules. Aircraft condition, service standards, and overall atmosphere remain stable across routes and schedules. You don't wonder what kind of flight you're about to get. It may not be the most expressive or intimate experience in the sky, but it's one of the most controlled. And now, there's only one airline left, the one that combines consistency with warmth, precision with presence, and manages to feel premium without ever feeling distant. Ready to see the winner? Number 1. Qatar Airways. What sets this experience apart isn't one standout feature, but how naturally everything works together. Nothing feels exaggerated, rushed, or performative. The flight simply unfolds in a way that feels coherent from beginning to end. The cabin environment strikes a careful balance. It's refined without being intimidating, comfortable without trying to impress through excess. Seating feels well thought out, lighting and noise are managed intelligently, and the overall atmosphere stays relaxed, even on very long routes. You're aware of the quality, but it never demands attention. Service plays a major role in that impression. Crews are present, confident, and genuinely attentive, without slipping into formality or distance. Interactions feel human rather than procedural. Requests are handled smoothly, often with a sense of timing that makes the experience feel effortless rather than managed. What really distinguishes the journey is flow. Meals, rest periods, and cabin activity feel naturally paced. There's no sense of being pushed through a process or held back by it. Everything moves forward with quiet confidence. Consistency ties it all together. Across different routes and aircraft, the experience remains remarkably stable. You don't need to adjust expectations or hope for a specific configuration. The baseline is already high. It's not the flashiest airline in the sky. It's not the most restrained either. What it delivers is balance between comfort and warmth, precision and flexibility. And that balance is what makes the experience stand out. That wraps up our ranking. From the most frustrating experiences to the airlines that still make long-haul flying feel worth it. Now I want to hear from you. Which Asian airline surprised you most in this ranking? Drop your thoughts and experiences in the comments. And if you want more honest breakdowns like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Travel smart and maybe think twice before choosing Air India.